Let me invite you to open your Bibles this morning to Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20. That's in the Old Testament, in case you're wondering. It's near the beginning. Numbers chapter 20. We've been working our way through a series on temptation and sin. And my purpose in doing that is really to address the biggest challenge that we all face as Christians, and that is the problem of personal sin. I think I'm reminded again and again as a pastor whenever I talk to people who are struggling is we just don't have the right expectations for what the Christian life is going to be about. We don't understand the impact of sin, the effects of sin. We don't understand the process of sanctification. And so my desire through this series has been to say, hey, let's just huddle up. Let's talk about this. Let's look at what it's like to live in a mixed condition, what we can expect whenever we're tempted, why we're tempted, and what God calls us to do in this process. You don't hear sin talked about much in our society unless it's used as some form of a marketing term, such as this, to describe a triple chocolate cake for dessert that is sinfully delicious or something like that, but we don't understand that sin is what separates us from God. God is our creator. He has authority over us. No matter whether you're a follower of Jesus or not, He is your creator. He is your sustainer. Every breath that you breathe is a gift from Him. You are taking up space on His real estate, on His earth. It is all happening according to His timetable. And you have to understand that the reason there are consequences for disobeying His rules. He's told us who He is and what He wants from us in His Word, the Bible. Whether you believe it or not, it is true. It is written by Him, and there is ultimate accountability from God. So sin is really any failure for us to obey or conform to His revelation, what He has said about us, and it comes across in our attitudes, in our words, in our actions. And the reason why is because we are by nature sinners. From the most cute newborn baby to the sweetest old grandma or grandpa, and all of us in between, every one of us is dealing with sinful flesh. It's part of our fallen nature. The fact that we're all born sinners is really bad for us in two ways. Before we understand the gospel, sin brings a penalty that we cannot pay, and that's why people who leave this earth without Jesus Christ go to a place of eternal torment called hell. Not popular, not common much anymore, but still present, still active, and so you have to understand that. So sin brings a penalty that we can't pay, and sin brings a power that we can't overcome. No matter how much we want to do the right thing before Christ, we can't do it because our will is restricted. It's restricted by our nature. We are sinners by nature. We choose what type of sin. We choose things that we will engage in and things that we won't, but even the good things are for the wrong reason. And so sin brings a penalty that is something that we cannot meet and a power we can't overcome. But the good news is that God sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to take care of sin for us fully. And because of the work of Christ on the cross, you and I have the ability to be forgiven of our sin, and that penalty has been canceled. It has been paid in full. We are no longer in debt. It is wiped completely free. It is removed. That debt is canceled, and sin no longer has power over us. We have the ability to obey God now because of the work of Christ in our life. So when you believe on Christ, whenever you receive forgiveness by repenting of your sin and trusting in the death of Christ on your behalf, you're forgiven. You're brand new. There's something inside that God does that causes you to be born again, and you become a new creation in Christ. But he wants you, once he's done that work in your life, he wants you to live differently than what you used to live. Whenever you were a slave to sin, whenever you planned your sin, whenever you loved your sin, he wants you to kill your sin. He wants you to pursue personal holiness. He wants you to pursue him. He wants you to live for his glory, not yours. And he provides a way for that to happen, and the process is called sanctification. We've been talking about it for a couple of weeks. That process is he has set you apart. He has given you a new heart, a new desire. He's given you a new want to, a new compass in life, a new purpose in life. He is transformed you from the inside out. And although we still have sinful flesh with desires that we have to compete with, he has given us a new nature. And so he wants us to go through this process of sanctification where we're becoming more like Jesus morally, spiritually stronger, having victory in our life as we're fighting against our sin, not throwing sticks at our sin, right, but killing sin. Great analogy of that. I heard a pastor give a message called hacking Agag to pieces. Like Samuel in the Old Testament took out his sword, and because Saul wouldn't do what he was supposed to do, he took the sword and he hacked Agag, the king of the Amalekites, to pieces. Graphic lesson on the way that you and I should be killing our sin. So, you have the ability to say no to temptation. All right? You do. You no longer have to say, yes, I'll take sin number 1 or sin number 3. You can say no to the enticements of sin, and that is called mortification, or putting sin to death in your life. All this is by way of review. If you're new with us, we've spent 2 weeks trying to kind of lay a foundation for this. The point is, sin is no longer your master as it was before you became a Christian. By God's grace and through the power of the Holy Spirit, you and I have the ability, whenever we come to the crossroad, to either choose to obey God or choose to disobey. We can now choose to obey because of the work that God has done for us in Christ. Because of that, you can and should avoid temptation. Now, let me talk for a minute about temptation. Temptation is not sin. Everyone experiences temptation. Temptation is that you come to a challenging situation and you don't know what way you're going to go. Maybe there's something that you want. Maybe there's something that you need. Maybe there's something that you don't want. Maybe somebody does something to you and you don't like it. Maybe you have an opinion about something that isn't especially helpful and you want to voice it. You want to get it out there, right? You want to say it, although you know that you shouldn't. You're at a crossroad. There's some challenging situation. And your response will either be a response of obedience, that you obey God, or a response of disobedience, that you choose to do things your way instead of God's. Before, you didn't have a choice. You were gonna one way or another do things your way. Now you have the ability in that moment of temptation, by God's grace and through the power of the Spirit, you have the ability to choose to obey God. Now, you need to know something, though, and that is that the temptation to sin, the temptation to disobey, becomes stronger or weaker dependent on what's going on in your heart, depending upon the attitudes of your heart, along with what you're choosing to believe about God's character and His Word. So as you're striving to live the Christian life, a lot of that is going to depend on whether you're humble or whether you're proud, whether you believe God's promises or whether you don't, whether you believe He'll be faithful or whether you don't. And so a lot of this is kind of going into your maturation process or your maturity as a Christian, is you understanding the need to really shepherd your own heart and the need for you to believe what God says and trust that He will do what He says that He's going to do. So with that as a pattern of understanding about temptation and understanding that you're going to face a choice on whether or not through some challenge, either you're going to choose to obey God or you're going to choose to disobey. Knowing that that's true for us, it was also true for ancient Israel. And as we're going to see this morning, it's also true in the life of Moses. So Numbers chapter 20. The book of Numbers is an interesting book because whenever the book of Numbers begins, it has been 1 year since God led Israel out of the land of Egypt. And the book of Numbers records the 40 years of wilderness wanderings where God is bringing consequences or discipline upon the nation of Israel because of the poor choices that they make. So at the beginning of Numbers, you begin with the generation that left Egypt, came to the border of the Promised Land. Spies were sent in to spy out the land. They came back. 2 of the spies said, "It's good. Hey, let's go. God's been faithful. This will be a great place." The rest of the spies said, "There's giants in there. We don't want to go there. We know it's what God says. We know it's what God provided, but you don't want to go there. Those giants are going to eat your lunch." Israel said, "That's it. We're not going in. We're going to get a new leader. We're going to go back to Egypt." And so God condemned them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years and that they would die in the wilderness until a new generation came up from within Israel, and then they would enter into the Promised Land. Numbers records that 40-year wilderness journey where Moses and Aaron are leading Israel through the wilderness, and you see everything that kind of takes place. Where we are now in chapter 20, Miriam, the sister of Moses, dies, and Aaron dies very soon after here in chapter 20. And we find out that the 40 years of wilderness wanderings are coming to an end. In particular, verses 1 through 13 of chapter 20 are a record of a temptation to sin that occurred in the lives of Moses and Aaron, the spiritual leaders of Israel. This temptation to sin happened in the life of both Moses and Aaron. I'm just going to single in on Moses so it's not as confusing and so that you can really see kind of what has taken place. Now, this is not my normal structure for a message. Normally, I'll take one timeless truth from a passage and I'll try to unpack that for you so that you can see how it applies in your life. I'm not going to do that with this, so it's going to be a little bit different structurally. Instead, I'm going to take this image of a tree that we've been working with the past couple of weeks, and I'm going to show you how the fruit of sin, the temptation comes and the fruit of sin is born, how it actually goes deeper into the roots of our heart, what you can't see, and some of the attitudes of our heart that are behind our sinful choices, and really how those roots grow in the soil of unbelief. And so I'm going to try to help us to see how that happens here within the lives of Moses and Aaron. Just to let you know, I said this was a record of a temptation that these men experienced. They had a choice to make. They could either choose to obey God or choose to disobey God. Spoiler alert, they failed the test. They blow it. They choose wrongly. They did not choose wisely. In fact, I titled the account here, Rebelling with Rebels, and you'll see more about that as we work our way through. My hope is that by unpacking the anatomy of this temptation to sin, that you and I can better learn what happens whenever we're tempted. We can learn that whenever we come to the crossroad, there's more going on than just the choice that we see. There are invisible roots of the attitude of our heart, and there is the soil of what we believe about God and His Word that is going to have an impact upon the choices that we make within the Christian life. My hope is that you and I can learn to mortify or put sin to death in our lives so that we might honor God by obeying Him. Sound good? All right, you ready for this? All right, here's the setting for the temptation of Moses and Aaron. Verse number 1 of Numbers chapter 20. Then the sons of Israel, the whole congregation, came to the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed at Kadesh. Now Miriam died there and was buried there. Miriam is the sister of Moses, who has been with him on this journey. She was a very important person in the life of Israel. Moses had to have been crushed by her death. She dies there and is now buried there. But there's another problem. Verse number 2. And there was no water for the congregation. Over in Israel, the climate is very similar to ours here. Much of it is desert area. This particular area, there was no water, and that is an issue. This must have been like deja vu, because the same thing occurred some 40 years earlier in exactly the same spot in Exodus chapter 17 and verses 1 through 7. The problem was there was no water for Israel. God used Moses in order to provide water for the nation there. God told Moses to get the people together, take the rod, and I want you to strike a rock, and water's going to come out. He did that. He was obedient. Water came out, and the people were able to drink. But there is a problem here. Again, there's no water for the congregation. So notice what happened in verse number 2. And they assembled themselves against Moses. Interesting word, assembled themselves. It means to gather together for the purpose of conflict. They called a congregational meeting, a Wednesday night congregational meeting. If you have a Baptist church background, it wasn't going to be a good situation at all. They assembled they assembled themselves against Moses and Aaron. Verse number 3 says, and the people thus contended with Moses. All right. So I told you this was just the setting for the temptation of Moses, but the setting for his temptation includes a separate temptation for the sons of Israel. You with me? All right, so setting this thing up, now the children of Israel are being tempted in their own way. They've got a choice to make. Will they obey God and do the right thing, or will they not? The temptation for Israel was to respond wrongly to the challenging situation of not having any water. In other words, dilemma, nothing to drink. This is a problem. We've got to be able to have water in order to survive. What are they going to do? Are they going to respond rightly, or are they going to respond wrongly? Spoiler alert again, it's right here within the text, right? They failed the test. They didn't do the right thing. They could have responded rightly, but the visible fruit of their sin, again, looking at our illustration here, was their contentious speech and their rebellion against Moses and Aaron. They assembled themselves together. They said, hey, let's get everybody together. We're going to give them a piece of our mind and let them know what poor leaders they are. We're going to really give them the business because they should have done more in order to make sure that our needs were met. They assembled themselves together. The people thus contended with Moses. Verse number 3. So it wasn't going well at all. We see that they were met with the temptation. They chose poorly. The visible fruit of their sin was their contentious speech and their rebellion against Moses and ultimately, as we'll see later, the Lord himself. How did they contend? Well, look at what it says in verse number 3. And they spoke, saying, if only we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. And you say, well, what's that all about? It is completely absurd. You say, well, what do you mean? They're referring to Korah's rebellion. If you're not familiar with the book of Numbers, a little bit earlier in chapter 16, there were 3 men who didn't like the leadership of Moses. Their names were Korah and Dathan and Abiram. And what they decided to do was they decided to institute themselves as spiritual leaders for Israel. So they had guys who were going to bring these censers, and they were going to offer incense, and they were going to take over. And so it was a coup in order to oust the leadership that God had established. And it was not pretty, because in this coup, Moses said, all right, You want to see who really is blessed of the Lord? If we're blessed and you're not, then the earth is going to open up and it's going to swallow up these men. So big earthquake happens. The earth opens up. It swallows Korah, Dathan, Abiram. It swallows all their families. It swallows all their possessions. Fire then comes down from the Lord. Fire consumes the 250 men who were offering incense that had not been commanded by God. And then God brings a plague that wipes out another 14,700 of the people. I mean, God is just leveling people. The earth opens up, swallows 3 of them and their families and all their possessions. Fire comes out, mows down 250 guys with the censers. A plague then comes through, wipes out almost another 15,000, all because of their rebellion against the Lord and against Moses. And these guys are complaining now to the point that they're saying that, hey, Moses, it would have been better if we would have died with Korah and all his group under God's judgment than be here now and be thirsty. Well, that's just stupid. Who in their right mind would choose to be judged by God and killed and be wiped out rather than to be put in a trial where you don't have something to drink? Verse number 4, it gets even worse. They continue with their rant. Why then, Moses, have you brought the Lord's assembly? They recognize themselves as God's assembly. Why have you brought the Lord's assembly into this wilderness? For us and our beasts to die here? In other words, is that why you did it? You brought us here because you just wanted us all to die? Verse 5, and why have you, notice the personal pronouns, why have you made us come up from Egypt to bring us to this wretched or evil place? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates. There's no water to drink. In other words, it's pretty frustrating, Moses. Why in the world did you bring us, the Lord's assembly, here to this place just to kill us? Why is it, Moses, that you brought us up from Egypt to this evil place? I mean, there's nothing to eat. There's nothing to drink. This is a dump. This is a dive. What were you doing? What are you even thinking? They are so frustrated because they don't have the things that they want. But what's interesting is that whenever you go back and look at Canaan that is described back in chapter 13, you find out that the fruit that they say that we don't have, like figs and grapes and pomegranates, all of that was actually in Canaan that they chose not to go in and take. And so now they're complaining because of the consequences of their sinful choices that they don't have what they want when God wanted to provide that for them all along. There's a man by the name of Ian Duguid that has written a great commentary, very helpful. And in it, he says that through this complaining, the Israelites model 2 ways that people often sinfully complain about their situation. One of them I had never heard before, but it makes perfect sense. It's called catastrophizing your situation. Now, we know what a catastrophe is. That's a noun, but they made a verb out of it. You are catastrophizing your situation. So what does that mean? It means that you really make your situation really worse than it is. I mean, in your complaint, you're saying, this is ridiculous. You paint your situation in far darker colors than what is really warranted. I mean, really, guys, is your situation so bad right now that you would rather be wiped out by fire from heaven than to be here in the wilderness without your favorite foods and without water to drink? I mean, yeah, you may be thirsty and you may be hungry, but God can meet your need. It's not as bad as you're making it out to be. But that's just what we do, right? In order to get our point across, in order to help people hear our complaints, we'll often catastrophize our situation and make it seem really worse than it really is. All the wailing and the head and the eye rolls and the moaning and groaning that we can come up with to say, I'm really not getting what I want. The other thing that this text exposes is that they were really good at blame shifting. You know what blame shifting is? Blame shifting happens whenever we don't want to face the consequences for our own wrong choices. In other words, it's not really my fault. What they were saying was, we're not here because we didn't want to go into the land of Canaan, and this is a consequence for our disobedience. They're shifting the blame and saying, Moses, you're the one who is at fault here. It's all your fault because you're really a poor leader. Duguid was great in this situation because he says in blame shifting, we act as if we have a blame retardant coating on our heart. In other words, no blame sticks to us. It's as if we're blame free, and it's always somebody else's fault. That's really kind of hard to deal with when someone does something wrong, and immediately what they try to do is, instead of saying, you're right, I was wrong, I shouldn't have done that, I'll try to do better next time. What do? They try to turn it around on you. They try to point out something that you've done wrong. They try to make an excuse for why it's going on. Blame shifting is no way to deal with wrongs that we commit. In fact, Duguid writes, this is a trend that started all the way back in the Garden of Eden, with the woman blaming the serpent and the man blaming the woman, and also God for God giving him the woman. Instead of blame shifting, we simply should take responsibility for our own action. So the visible fruit of the sin for the people of Israel was their contentious speech against Moses and their rebellion against him. But why did they do that? Why did they behave like that? Because the invisible root of their sin was self-exaltation or pride. In other words, they thought, we're better than this. We don't deserve to be treated like this. I mean, after all, we deserve to be in a place where we've got plenty of water to drink, that we've got grain and figs, we've got grapes and pomegranates. I mean, we deserve to be treated better than what we're doing. So the invisible root of their sin was actually coming from personal pride. Because of the pride that was in their heart, they were making a sinful choice to rebel against the leader that God had established. Now, I told you this was the heavy lifting of the Christian life, because you're trying to figure out, why do I say the things that I say? And that was dumb of me. That hurt the other person. I shouldn't have said that. I shouldn't have done that. Why do I do this? You're trying to go past the visible fruit and look at the invisible root of your sin that goes into your heart, and then there's something that goes even deeper, and that is the invisible roots of our sin grow in the soil of unbelief. The problem for Israel was that they were completely disregarding God. They recognized themselves as the Lord's assembly. They recognized the people that died as being judged by the Lord, but that was about it. They weren't recognizing that God was the one who brought them out into the wilderness from Egypt, but they said, Moses, why did you bring us out of Egypt into this place? And Moses, why are you not providing the food that we want to eat and the water that we want to drink? They completely left God out of the picture. They disregarded him. They were only looking at their life on a horizontal level and not looking at their life on a vertical level, with God being in control of every step of their situation. So what do you do now? So this is all the setting for Moses. And the problem is you've got these people that are resisting your authority. They're wrongly attacking you. They're questioning your character. They're questioning your leadership. They're charging you with being responsible for everything that is wrong in their life. How are you going to respond? Have you ever had anybody attack you? Have you ever had anybody accuse you? Have you ever had anybody do to you what they were doing to Moses? It is not easy to respond rightly. So what happened? Verse number 6. Then Moses and Aaron came in from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. They did what they did all the times before whenever Israel acted crazy. They decided that they would go into the tent of meeting where the presence of the Lord was manifested. They would fall upon their face in the presence of God, and they would make their case known and see how God would respond. So what happened previously as you read through the book of Numbers? Well, normally what would happen is they would go in before the Lord, and the Lord would respond in some act of judgment against these Israelites. And it would be pretty ugly. Some scourge or some flaming judgment or something that he would do against this rebellious people. Just to give you a couple of examples, in Numbers chapter 11, the people were complaining about their situation, and the Lord burned up the edges of the camp of Israel. Again, in Numbers chapter 11, the Israelites got tired of eating manna that God had given them. Oh, we're just sick of eating this stuff that God gives us to eat. We want meat. And so do you remember what God did? He gave them quail. And he didn't just give them a few. He stacked them up really, really high. In fact, it was so bad that they were eating quail, it says, until it started coming out of their nostrils. They were just, they had so much of it, it became a plague. And God was judging them through that. Numbers chapter 12, you find Aaron and Miriam challenging the authority of Moses. And do you remember what happened? God struck Miriam with leprosy and banished her from the camp for 7 days. And whenever the people heard the report of the spies coming out of Canaan, do you remember what they did? They said, hey, listen, we're not going into Canaan. We're going to choose a new leader for ourselves, one that will take us back to Egypt. And God responded by cursing those Israelites so that they would wander in that wilderness for 40 years and ultimately die in the wilderness. And then you got the whole thing with Korah and Dathan and Abiram and the 450 incense bearers and all the people that were on board with that. God was just wiping people out as you go through this. So every time that the people would rise up sinfully against Moses and Aaron, they would go before the Lord, and the Lord would just say, whoosh, and just kind of take care of the problem, right? And so they were probably expecting this same thing to happen again in this situation. And so what happened? You read in verse number 6, then Moses and Aaron came from the presence of the assembly to the doorway of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces. Then the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Here's God. And he appears to them in this tent of meeting. Can't you just see they're on their faces and maybe looking up and they see the glory of the Lord. And God is there in all of his wonder. But this time there's no fire. This time there's no judgment. This time there's no words of anger or God saying what he's going to do to them. There is just a gentle word from God telling Moses to take his staff or his rod and to go with Aaron and bring the people together, and water will come from the rock and feed or satisfy the community and their thirst. Notice verse 7. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it may yield its water. When this happened 40 years ago, God said to Moses, I want you to take the rod, and I want you to get the people together, and I want you to strike the rock with the rod, and water's going to come out. Moses did exactly what God told him, and the people were able to drink water. But here it's a little bit different. Take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron assemble the congregation and speak to the rock. What does it say? Before their eyes, that it may yield its water. You shall thus bring forth water for them out of the rock, and let the congregation and their beast drink. I don't think that was what Moses expected. That's surprising. God's reaction to the faithless rebellion is not wrath, it's grace. God commands Moses to take his rod and speak to the rock in the presence of the people, and they're going to be able to drink water. And that's it. It's pretty amazing. Instead of giving wrath, which they would have earned, God, in his characteristic fashion, instead gives grace. Now, just to stop right there for just a second, that encourages me. I hope it encourages you. Whenever we do the wrong thing, there is a gracious God who is there and able to give us grace. And that is exactly what he's doing here. But evidently, it's not what Moses thought they should have. Because here, this thing kind of turns the corner. All that was background in order for the temptation with Moses and Aaron. And the temptation for Moses and Aaron is to respond rightly or to respond wrongly to this group of people who has now attacked him one more time. I mean, he's probably had it. He could have done the right thing and done exactly what God said, or he could have done something different. Spoiler alert, they failed the test. They didn't do the right thing. But let's walk through this and see why this happened. Look at verse number 9. So Moses took the rod from before the Lord, just as he had commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly before the rock. I mean, so far, so good, right? He's doing exactly what God told him to do. And he said to them, all right, stop right there. That's a problem. God didn't tell him to talk to them. God said speak what? To the rock. He didn't want to speak to the rock. He wanted to speak to them. He had some choice words for them and for the way that they had done him and the things they had said to him. And so he begins to unload on these people. And notice what he says, listen now, you rebels. Shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? It's almost like Moses has had it up to here with the rebellion of these people, and he just explodes. I mean, have you ever noticed that some people clam up and some people blow up whenever they're angry? Well, we don't know what Moses' normal pattern is, but it's not this. In fact, he's prayed for the people before and asked God not to wipe them all out. But here what he does is he just goes off on them. Maybe Moses is thinking, okay, God, you should really just level these people. You should just wipe them out. Maybe he was disappointed because God was giving them grace instead of wrath. I don't know what role the death of Miriam played in this, other than it marked the transition of the end of the 40 years. Maybe he was emotionally traumatized because of the death of his sister. Maybe he was just looking at that and saying, listen, it's been 40 years now and nothing about these people have changed. And frankly, I've had it. It was one way with the older group and they're all dead. It seems to be the very same way with this new group. And so nothing has changed. You are rebellious as your parents were. And so he just speaks harshly to them and lets them have it. He says, listen now, you rebels. He's commanding them. He's getting their attention. And he calls them rebels. He calls them those who don't like to listen, who don't like to obey. And what's interesting is he's using the very same language to describe the Israelites that God previously had used to describe them. God had judged them. God had said, this is what you are. And Moses says, I'll use your words, God, and I will let them have it. Moses was faced with the temptation of how would he respond to these people who had sinfully attacked him, and Moses fails. The visible fruit of his sin was his sinful anger against the people and his rebellious disobedience to God. He chose to speak harshly to them. He chose to speak in anger. He was probably raising his voice and yelling at them. And he chose to do something other than what God had told him to do. And that's not all. In his rage, he continued to disobey the Lord. In verse number 11, notice what it says. Then Moses lifted up his hand and he struck the rock. Twice, not just once. He was so angry that once wasn't enough, and so he struck the rock twice with his rod. And the most amazing thing happened. And water came forth abundantly. And the congregation and their beasts drank. The visible fruit of his sin, anger against the people, disobedience with God. But there was something deeper that was going on within the heart of Moses, because the invisible root of his sin was self-exaltation and pride. Moses didn't like these people. He had had it with them. In fact, his pride was so deep and so hurt that he had just had it. He probably didn't think about what it was that he said to them whenever he called them rebels, but in essence, he had set himself up to be their judge. God was no longer the judge of these people. Moses was. He said, listen, I've had it with you guys. This is what you are. You're a bunch of stinking rebels. You need to listen to what I'm saying, and you need to watch what I'm about to do here. You see, it's one thing for God to make that declaration about them, but it's something entirely different for Moses to do so. And then on top of that, he struck the rock twice, which was an act of direct disobedience. But did you notice what Moses said before he struck the rock? He said, listen now, you rebels, shall we bring forth water for you out of this rock? He wasn't talking about God. He was talking about himself and Aaron. He was so tired of them questioning his leadership and questioning his authority that he decided to show them who the true deliverer was, and he struck the rock twice, and water came out. Moses had not only set himself up as the judge of Israel, but he'd also set himself up as their deliverer. And do you know who provided water from the rock for the people? It was the Lord. It wasn't Moses. It was the Lord who did that. But in his frustration with the people, Moses was drawn into the same mindset that they had. He forgot the vertical dimension and God who was there and able to do exactly what needed to be done, and he was only thinking on the horizontal level. I can fix this. I'll tell you what you need to hear. I'll do exactly what you need to be done. Moses presented himself as if he were some pagan magician able to bring water from the rock in order to provide for the people that he was trying to lead. Now, you know what? Moses is certainly not the only one to be guilty of judging other people or to be trying to deliver them by their own strength. I mean, we do that with other people, don't we? We are able to often see into people's hearts, or at least that we think that we can, and we'll pronounce judgments on them, and we'll try to maybe conform them or get them to do what we want them to do, and we leave God completely out of the picture. And so this isn't something that only Moses does. We can all be prone to this type of sinful response. But there was a problem here, and God was going to deal with it. Yes, he had provided water for the people, but now he was going to provide what was needed for Moses and Aaron. Verse number 12 says, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you have not believed me, to treat me as holy in the sight of the sons of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." We talked a little bit about the visible fruit of his sin was his anger against the people and his disobedience to God, and that invisible root was pride and self-exaltation and to think that he could give them exactly what they needed. But the invisible roots of his sin really grew in the soil of unbelief, in the sense that God equated believing in him with obeying him. And Moses and Aaron showed that they really did not believe God because they did not trust that his way or his plan was best. Have you ever done that? Have you ever thought, well, I know what the Lord would have me to do, but I think that my way will get the job done better? You see, God's plan was grace. God's plan was not confrontation. God's plan was Moses gathering the people together and merely speaking to the rock, and God would bring forth water, and God would solve the problem, and he would give these rebels grace, even what they don't deserve. Moses just simply wasn't believing that God's way was best, and so he chose to do something different. He didn't treat God as holy by reverencing him, and that's proven through his own personal disobedience. You know what the ironic thing is? By his disobedience to the Lord, Moses joined the people in their rebellion against God. In other words, by rebelling, he joined the rebels. In fact, God tells Moses that specifically in Numbers 27:14. This is what God says to Moses: "For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to treat me as holy before their eyes at the water." Now, you know what's interesting is I was reading through this and thinking that there's a lot to say about spiritual leadership and how to deal with people who don't want to follow your leadership. And it's so common to get frustrated. It's so common to get angry. It's so common in order to try to make people do what you want them to do or speak to them in a way that would cause them to get in line. And none of that honors Christ. And you have to really guard against it. But it goes on a much more basic level to the temptations that we all experience. And one thing that is conspicuously absent, there is no justification for the misbehavior of Moses. No matter how ugly those people were to him, no matter what kind of ungodly things they said to him, no matter how they left God completely out of the picture, Moses was not justified in sinning against God. Do you know that no matter how much your children disobey, it is never justification for yelling at your kids? No matter how much your spouse may say or do things that you don't like, we are never justified at speaking in anger against our spouse. No matter how much our boss or our neighbor or anyone else may do things that are frankly ungodly, we always have the responsibility to obey our God and to do things his way. And yet, honestly, guys, we all have pride in our heart. We all think, I don't deserve this. You're not going to talk to me that way. You're not going to treat me that way. And we want to do things our way, and we forget who's really in control. And we often fail in our temptation. Choices have consequences. And because Moses disobeyed, he was not allowed to lead the people into the promised land. He had rebelled with the rebels. How does it all end? Look at verse 13 and what it says. Those were the waters of Meribah. Meribah means contention or quarreling. Not a place where you go to get a drink normally, right? Those were the waters of Meribah. Why? Because the sons of Israel contended with the Lord, and he proved himself holy among them. Now, I got to thinking about that, and I'm looking at that text, and I'm thinking, how did God prove himself holy among the people of Israel who were contending with him at Meribah? He did it in two ways. The first way is God proved himself to be the judge, not Moses. And he proved himself to be the judge by bringing the needed judgment upon Moses and Aaron. They needed to be dealt with, and God dealt with them appropriately. And yet, you know what? He was even gracious in that judgment. Although Moses wasn't allowed to take the people into the promised land, he took him up on top of a mountain, and he did let him look at the land. He did show him, Moses, this is the land that these people are going to be taken into. So God proved himself to be holy by proving himself to be the judge. And second, he proved himself holy by being the deliverer of his people. He supplied the needed water for the people. Really a remarkable passage. God is so in control of every situation, and we so quickly forget that. In the midst of our temptation, in the midst of our difficulty, we think that we need to act and do things our way instead of following what God says and trusting that his way is better than ours. You know, ultimately, God proves himself to be both judge and deliverer through the gospel. It's an amazing thing to think about. He's so big and he's so powerful that he not only came up with a way to judge the sin of man, my sin, your sin, but he did it in a way that delivered us. In other words, he did it in a way that caused us to be able to be forgiven. And he did it at personal sacrifice to himself. The Father sent the Son into the world to live a sinless life and die a sacrificial death so that our sin could be paid for, and yet so that we could be forgiven. That's awesome. Lord, nothing really changes with the heart of man. We see the rebellion in the hearts of the nation of Israel. We see the anger and the rebellion in the heart of even Moses and Aaron, and we recognize that so often that anger and that rebellion is present within our own heart. And thank you for the way that you teach us about that in your word. Thank you for grace. Thank you that you meet our needs often whenever we are even unaware of what they are. We come to the table this morning just recognizing that even though we are saved by your grace, we are still contending with our sinful flesh and living in this mixed condition, and we want to be sanctified. We want to mortify our sin and put it to death. And yet it's a struggle. And yet we're reminded again and again of how much you love us and the tools that you've given us. That you've given us your word, you've given us your spirit, you've given us the body of Christ. You're active in our life, and we're not like we were yesterday, but we're not like we will be tomorrow, and you're at work in our hearts, and we just want to say thank you. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for being patient with us. Thank you for helping us to grow. Thank you for the way that you remind us even today through communion of how much you loved us by sending your only Son to die in our place. Father, I pray that as we partake of the bread and the cup, that our hearts would be filled with humility and gratitude because of the perfect obedience of our Lord Jesus Christ. May your Spirit remind us that we belong to you, and because of that, everything is going to be okay. We commit this time to you and pray that our hearts would be encouraged as we seek to honor you. In Jesus' name.